Forget New Year, New You. This season is about slowing down, locking the doors, and cozying up at home with the one you really want to do nothing with. Your dog. After the holiday chaos, those quiet nights with a blanket, a podcast, and your pup feel like the reset you actually need. Ollie helps make those moments easier with fresh protein-packed meals made from real human-grade ingredients, so your dog can enjoy some quality comfort food too. Choose from 5 recipes and get a personalized plan for your dog's needs. Meals arrive perfectly proportioned with a scoop and storage container, so serving is fast and mess-free. And with Ollie's in-app on-demand health screenings, supporting your dog is easy, ensuring more cuddles for many years to come. Visit ollie.com/truecrime and use code TRUECRIME for 60% off your first box.
At Arizona State University, we're bringing world-class education from our globally acclaimed faculty to you. Earn your degree from the nation's most innovative university. Online. That's a degree better. Learn more at asuonline.asu.edu.
This episode of the Court Junkie podcast is sponsored by Lifeway Kefir. If you haven't gone to lifewaykefir.com/courtjunkie yet, please do. You'll get a $1 off coupon for Lifeway Kefir's dairy drinks, and you'll be helping out this podcast at the same time. And I have to tell you, I've been drinking those kefir dairy drinks for quite some time now, but I recently tried their organic kefir cups, and I was not disappointed. Kefir cups are a spoonable snack that is served in a convenient on-the-go cup. Kefir cups have the same thick, creamy texture as Greek yogurt, but they have twice as many probiotics. They come in delicious flavors like honey, raspberry chocolate, blueberry lavender, and a bunch more. Go to lifewaykefir.com/courtjunkie to redeem that coupon. That's Lifeway, KEFIR.com/courtjunkie. Hi, this is Jillian, and you are listening to episode 14 of the Court Junkie podcast. First, I want to thank all of you for listening, subscribing, leaving me reviews, donating. I obviously could not do any of this without you, so I really appreciate your support. If you want to do more to support this podcast, you can donate as little as $1 a month on Patreon. Just go to courtjunkie.com/support and you can sign up there. You'll also get access to ad-free versions of these episodes. And thanks to Maggie, a friend of this podcast, I learned how to make RSS feeds available on Patreon, so you can listen to these ad-free episodes on your favorite podcast listening app. And lastly, please consider joining my Facebook discussion group, where we talk about these episodes and basically everything true crime and courtroom related. Just go to courtjunkie.com/Facebook. Today's case is another one that was pretty close to home for me. In fact, it all happened about an hour away from where I live, in Chicago. But I have to issue a warning before I get into this episode, because it is incredibly, incredibly tragic. And there are some details that are likely going to affect you in a way that's going to make you want to hug your loved ones and keep them close. But I think the details in this case are important, and you'll see why when I get to them. Now, on to the episode. It was shortly after 5 a.m. on Thursday, June 14th, 2007. John Spear was driving along Interstate 55 near Channahon, Illinois, on his way to work when he saw a man stumbling down the side of the frontage road. The man was bleeding, and he was waving his arms for help. John pulled his car over to the side of the road. "I think my wife shot me," the man said. He then mumbled something about her having the kids. John helped the man get into his pickup truck, and then he called 911. He used a rag to apply pressure to the man's wound on his leg. During the 911 call, the man mumbled in the background, "Red Ford," and "I got out," but he wouldn't say anything else. John told the dispatcher that he feared that the man was going into shock. The bleeding man was 32-year-old Christopher Vaughn, a computer forensic advisor who owned his own company and lived in Oswego, Illinois. Christopher was married to Kimberly, who was 34, and they had 3 young children, 12-year-old Abigail, 11-year-old Cassandra, and 8-year-old Blake. And what Christopher was about to reveal to police was nothing short of horrifying. When police arrived at the scene, they found Christopher standing with John. Christopher told them, "She's down there." He pointed to a red 2004 Ford Expedition that was parked along the side of the road. Inside the vehicle, investigators were stunned to find the bodies of Kimberly and their 3 young children. They had all been shot and killed. Kimberly was in the front passenger seat, slumped over to one side. She had a bullet wound underneath her chin. In the back seat, the bodies of Abigail, Cassandra, and Blake were all slumped forward. They were still buckled into their seat belts. There was shattered glass and shell casings on the floor, and there was blood spatter all over the vehicle. In the back of the SUV, there was a beach towel and a cooler, and paperback books were stuffed into the seat pockets, as though the family had been going on a road trip. And there, on the floorboard, was a pair of little girls' shoes. And then there was a trail of blood that led down the road to where Christopher had flagged down the passing motorist. Investigators told reporters at the scene that they believed it was a domestic issue. They said Christopher Vaughn was being questioned, but that he was not under arrest. They said he was answering their questions and assisting us greatly. Meanwhile, Christopher was taken to the hospital and was reportedly in a daze. He had suffered 2 gunshot wounds, one to the wrist and one to the thigh. He asked investigators if his wife knew that he was in the hospital because she always wonders where he's at. He then said that he was angry because the firemen had ruined his jacket. He said that he had gotten it from the Yukon in Canada. Investigators would later recall that Christopher never asked how his children were doing. A short time later, Christopher finally told investigators what had happened, at least his first version of what happened. While lying in his hospital bed, he told them that he pulled the SUV off to the side of the road because Kimberly had been nauseated. He said he got out to check the roof rack and he saw blood on his leg. He said he told Kimberly that he was hurt and that he was going to go for help. And that was it. He said he never saw a gun and he didn't hear any gunshots. Christopher was questioned a total of 3 times, but each time he was released, and investigators insisted to reporters that he wasn't a suspect, that he was cooperating, and that they had no plans to keep him under surveillance. Investigators were tight-lipped about their investigation, but it was what they weren't saying that was the most interesting. When reporters asked if Kimberly had been murdered, authorities would not say who they suspected fired the gun. But they did say that the sight of the woman and her 3 children had been so horrific and was so difficult on the officers that a police chaplain was brought out to provide counseling to them. As the days went by, the shock at what happened only seemed to grow. The family had seemed so perfect to friends, neighbors, and community members. Christopher and Kimberly had even been featured in a Chicago Sun-Times real estate article months prior, describing the new house that they were building in the Oswego neighborhood. Accompanying the article was a photo of the couple, seated at a dining room table with their 3 children happily standing behind them. The memorial for Kimberly, Abigail, Cassandra, and Blake started with a visitation on Friday, June 22nd, 2007, and the funeral services were held the next morning. They were held in St. Charles, Missouri, where the family had lived prior to moving to Illinois. On that Saturday morning, just hours before the funeral was scheduled to begin, investigators showed up at the funeral home and took Christopher into custody. He was charged with the murder of his wife, 2 daughters, and 1 son. Meanwhile, the memorial for Kimberly and her children went on. About 100 photographs were displayed on 4 different poster boards at the church, and only one of the photos, a small picture of the family, showed Christopher. Later that day at the family's home in Oswego, Illinois, friends and neighbors placed 4 crosses on the sidewalk, with each victim's name on them. Dozens of people gathered for a prayer vigil, and they released white balloons in honor of Kimberly and her children. Christopher was extradited to Illinois and held without bond. 3 months after his arrest, prosecutors made the announcement that they were going to seek the death penalty against Christopher. Will County State's Attorney James Glasgow said that although Christopher didn't have a prior criminal history, this crime cries out for the ultimate punishment. But that would soon change. While Christopher was in jail awaiting trial for his capital murder case, the death penalty in Illinois was abolished. I spoke with John Seidel from the Chicago Sun-Times. He explained to me how he first got the assignment to cover this case.
I was actually assigned to the Will County Courthouse full-time starting around April 2011. And by that time, the case was a little bit dormant. As you know, it had started out as a death penalty case in Illinois. It abolished the death penalty. So it had been going through a lot of extra procedures because of the death penalty. As I came in, that had ended. What was interesting was that the case was still under seal when I got to the courthouse. And at some point, it was kind of quietly unsealed. And we had the opportunity to be the first to report on a lot of the motions that had been filed in the case, which revealed some details we hadn't heard before, including that Vaughn had gone to a shooting range the night before the murder, that he had an article about making a homicide look like an accident or a suicide or something, basically about staging a murder, so that it wouldn't look like one of those. That kind of detail was in there. But as far as covering the trial, it just came along as part of my beat at the Will County Courthouse when it was set to go to trial. I was obviously the reporter who was responsible for covering it.
As John said, some of the unsealed motions in the case revealed some shocking information. The prosecution was alleging that Christopher had used that murder weapon at a shooting range the night before the murders. And not only that, but he had allegedly been looking up how to make a murder look like a suicide. Christopher's trial began in August 2012. It was held at the Will County Courthouse in Joliet, Illinois, in the same building and at the same time as the Drew Peterson trial. For those of you who are familiar with Drew Peterson, the former Bolingbrook, Illinois police sergeant who was convicted of murdering his 3rd wife after his 4th wife, Stacy, went missing, you know that this was a huge case in this area. Drew Peterson coverage absolutely dominated, even the national news, and there was even a Lifetime movie made about the case. Christopher Vaughn's trial, however, didn't get as much coverage. I talked to John about that aspect.
And it's hard to talk about the atmosphere in Vaughn without talking about the atmosphere in Drew Peterson, because you're right, these were 2 big trials right next door to each other. I haven't seen anything like it since. So Drew started first. I was kind of second chair on covering that, and I moved over when Vaughn started, was first chair on that. I went back to the end on Drew and then came back for the end on Vaughn. So it was kind of back and forth like that. Anyone who followed the Drew Peterson case, which of course is the former Bolingbrook police sergeant who was convicted of killing his 3rd wife, Drew Peterson has a very bizarre, outgoing personality, and he had several attorneys who were very outgoing and flashy, and they came out of the courthouse every day to talk to the TV cameras. And it was totally the opposite in the Vaughn trial. And it was a very serious matter at the heart of it. In the Drew Peterson case, we're talking about a murder, but in the Vaughn trial, you're talking about 4 murders, and 3 of them are small children who were killed. And regardless of who you believed, these were 3 small children killed by a parent. So everything was much more serious and somber in that courtroom, which, again, you walk out into the hallway and there's a whole big crowd for the other one. The other thing that made a difference is, as you know, my friends in TV, when they're reporting on these things, they need something that they can put on the screen for viewers to watch. And with the Vaughn case, of course, there's B-roll of when the murders first took place. But they didn't have the lawyers. Christopher Vaughn's defense lawyer did not come outside the courthouse and give fresh quotes to the cameras every day. He just wasn't talking. And so as far as getting coverage, attracting TV coverage, it didn't attract as much because it was kind of hard to report on when you had all of that material right next door with Drew Peterson. So there was a big difference between the two.
I can attest to what John is saying, because I actually attended a few days of the Drew Peterson trial, and I saw firsthand how much the attorneys in that case seemed to really love the media attention. Every day after court, Drew Peterson's attorneys would go out to the front lawn of the courthouse and hold a press conference where they talked about, and sometimes even joked about, what had happened in the courtroom that day. By contrast, Christopher's trial was the exact opposite. On August 20th, 2012, opening statements began, with Judge Daniel Rozak presiding. As Christopher sat stone-faced at the defense table, Will County Assistant State's Attorney Deborah Mills outlined a list of reasons why Christopher Vaughn would want to kill his family. Among the reasons, she said, was his affinity for strippers and a desire to start a new life in the Canadian wilderness. She called it an exit scenario from a troubled marriage, and she said that Christopher had planned the murders and had even practiced firing the murder weapon at a shooting range the night before the murders took place, as his wife was at home cooking dinner for their neighbors. She then took jurors through what the prosecution would show had happened the morning of June 14th, 2007. She said before dawn, Christopher had woken up his family on the pretense of taking them on a surprise trip to a water park in Springfield, Illinois. After they were all in the car, Christopher pulled off the interstate. She said he turned onto an isolated frontage road and then shot and killed his wife and 3 children as they sat buckled into the family's SUV. He then shot himself in the wrist and leg before dropping the gun between Kimberly's feet. He then flagged down a passing car. In one of his interrogations by investigators, Mills said that Christopher told him that his wife had been the one responsible for the shooting and that she had shot him twice before he fled the SUV. She said Christopher told police that Kimberly had been upset over his religious beliefs and his confession of having cheated on her. His ultimate goal, Mills told the jury, was for Christopher to get rid of his family so that he could move to a remote part of Canada. She said he had visited there a month prior to killing his family. Mills concluded by telling the jury that the blood evidence inside the vehicle, as well as on Christopher's clothing, would prove that he was the real killer, along with common sense. Christopher's defense attorney, Assistant Will County Public Defender George Lennard, told the jury in his opening statements that Christopher and Kimberly did in fact have a troubled marriage, but he said Christopher loved his family and that Kimberly was the one who had killed their children, shot him in the wrist and leg, and then killed herself. Lennard said Kimberly had been taking a combination of medications for her migraines, high blood pressure, and anxiety. He said there were emails that Kimberly had sent to her doctor saying that she was concerned that the meds were causing a personality change. He said in another email to her friend she called herself Mommy Monster, and in yet another email sent in October 2005, she wrote, "Even though we are all human beings, we all have a little animal in us that can snap." Leonard told the jury, "It's a case of murder-suicide. Christopher Vaughn is not responsible for the deaths." The prosecution's first few witnesses set the scene, which was an obviously tragic and gruesome one. First responders testified about finding the family's bodies in the SUV off I-55 in Channahon. Channahon Police Sergeant Steve Weiss testified that his first reaction when he first came across the bodies inside the SUV was, "Oh my God." He became emotional as he went over the photos from the crime scene.
They showed very clear photographs of Kimberly Vaughn dead in the car. They did not hold back when it came to Kimberly. You saw what the investigators saw when they arrived at the scene. As for the children, they were not as graphic. I do remember a photo or two where you see the tops of their little heads leaning out of the car after investigators got to the scene. But it was really that photo of Kimberly, that was just really the horror of it. And the jurors, I don't remember too much instant reaction. I went back and looked. There were some jurors who I think I remember they were looking at the photos during opening statements and they were wiping tears away from their eyes. And I remember there was one who just had her hand over her mouth while they were looking at them. And the sad thing about that photo too, I don't want to say I got used to seeing it or that they got used to seeing it, but that photo was seen very, very often during the trial. It got to so it wasn't as shocking by the end, but when you first saw it, boy, it was. And I should say that Kimberly had family in the front row of that courtroom too, who saw that photo as well. And I remember thinking that some of them seemed to be struggling. Obviously, you would, looking at that photo.
The jury heard excruciating testimony about how each victim had been killed. According to the prosecution's case, Kimberly was killed when Christopher put his 9mm handgun under her chin and pulled the trigger. 12-year-old Abigail was then killed next. She was seated behind Christopher, and she was shot in the chest and then the head, still holding on to his stuffed animal and a copy of Harry Potter. That was according to testimony from an emotional firefighter. 11-year-old Cassandra was killed next, in the same way, her body falling to the right, almost on top of her 8-year-old brother Blake. And then lastly, Blake was killed. And you know how you're feeling right now after just hearing those awful details? Well, Christopher did not display any emotion, and he refused to even look at the photos while they were being displayed to the jury. A paramedic testified that he treated Christopher's leg just yards away from the SUV, where Christopher's wife and kids lay dead. And as he was cutting Christopher's pant leg, Christopher looked like he was in a daze, and he was unable to answer any questions, when suddenly he seemed to snap out of it. He told the paramedic to make sure not to mess up his new cowboy boots that he was wearing. Kimberly's mom took the stand and described to the jury how she first heard about the deaths of her daughter and 3 grandchildren. She said that she saw the family's car on a TV news report and that she could make out her daughter's body in the front seat. Kimberly's twin sister, Nikki, also testified. She was asked to identify Christopher in court, and she angrily stared at him and said, that's him. Nikki said her sister was in good spirits in the days leading up to her death. She said she and her sister were close and that they talked to each other almost daily. Kimberly's father testified that the week of the shootings, Christopher's personality had changed and that he would leave the house without saying goodbye. Prosecutors focused a lot on Christopher's behavior leading up to the murders. A strip club manager testified that Christopher had spent nearly $5,000 at their strip club during 2 visits in June 2007. A former exotic dancer testified that she had spent an hour and a half in a private room with Christopher, but instead of dancing, they sat and talked. She said Christopher told her that he was single and didn't have any kids. She said he was very timid, very shy, and uncomfortable seeming. And yet another exotic dancer said she had met with Christopher 4 or 5 times. She said he talked about his wife, but he never mentioned having any kids. She said he told her that he wasn't happy in his marriage, and she said that he seemed upset during one visit when he said that his wife spent $5,000 on curtains. He told her that he was planning on leaving his wife and that she was going to get what she deserved and that she wasn't going to see it coming. She testified that she went to police after she recognized Christopher on the news. Jurors also heard testimony about Kimberly's mindset prior to the killings. Knowing that the defense was going to try and pin it on her, prosecutors showed the jury dozens of emails and text messages Kimberly had sent in the weeks before her death. They were trying to show that she wasn't distraught and she wasn't suicidal, that she was making plans for the future. In emails Kimberly wrote to her classmates from University of Phoenix, where she was taking online classes, Kimberly even called her husband a hero. And in others, she wrote about how much she loved her schoolwork. She was going for her degree in criminal justice administration. The night prior to her death, Kimberly was working on a project that was due, and she had sent emails saying that she would be devoting more time to it the next day. I need to pause here real quick and take a moment to thank my sponsor, Lifeway Kefir, for sponsoring this episode. I know I've told you a lot about Lifeway Kefir dairy drinks, but I bet you didn't know that they also have frozen kefir, cups and cheese, and supplements. As I said earlier, I recently tried their kefir cups, and they are delicious, just like their dairy drinks. Go to lifewaykefir.com/courtjunkie for an exclusive offer just for you court junkies. That's Lifeway, KEFIR.com/courtjunkie. Now, back to the episode. One of the most interesting parts of the trial was hearing from Christopher himself, not through his own testimony, but from his videotaped interrogations with investigators in the hours after his family was found dead.
After the murders, the police went and questioned Christopher, and they used all kinds of tactics during that interrogation. They tried to play nice, and then sometimes they just berated him with vulgar terms and tried to belittle him. They'd call him names. They told him, there are cameras up in that cell phone tower, because the murder happened right next to a cell phone tower. There were no cameras in that cell phone tower, at least not that anybody ever brought in evidence of, but they were telling him that, there are cameras up in that cell phone tower. And then they had one officer came in and said that, he had a screwed up marriage too. And so he tried to sympathize and tried to get Vaughn to open up that way. They showed him photos of his children.
Videotaped interrogations are always interesting to me because it gives you really good insight into the early stages of the investigation when no one in the public or in the media really knows what's going on. In this case, while everyone was struggling to understand what had exactly happened, and investigators were telling reporters that Christopher was not a suspect, he was actually being grilled in a lengthy interrogation. And these particular series of interviews were taken from about 5 hours after the killings to within days afterwards. Christopher, wearing his hospital gown, calmly tells the investigators that he woke the children at 4 a.m. that morning and told them to get in the SUV for a surprise trip to a water park in Springfield. He said the children had fallen asleep in the back seat, and he pulled the vehicle over because Kimberly thought she was going to be sick after taking a new migraine medication. He said he got out to check the carrier on the roof, and he felt a pain in his leg, and then he saw that he was bleeding. He said he got back into the car and then fell head first out of the vehicle and stumbled down the road until he flagged down a passing motorist. He said that when he got to the hospital, he was informed that he had been shot. He said he thought that was impossible because there was nobody else around and his wife didn't own a gun. You could tell the investigators were not buying his version of events. In fact, the interrogation videos got pretty intense, almost like what you'd see in the movies or on an episode of the TV show Chicago PD.
I wrote a story while they were showing the interrogation video, talking to some experts about how it might play in front of the jury, because some of these tactics were pretty heavy-handed. And Vaughn responded to them. He crumpled up one of the photos, or two of the photos of the kids, I think, and threw them at the cops and said, "I want to leave, unlock the door." It got very heated in there, and they got him to a point where he actually grabbed, I think it was Abigail and Cassandra's photos. The 3 photos were there on the table, and the officer, Vaughn was messing with the photos, and the officer said, "Don't touch my photos, don't touch my," just messing with mine. And finally, Vaughn crumpled up the pictures of the 2 girls and threw them at the cop and said he wanted to leave, something like that. And then they left him alone in the room, all by himself, with just a photo of Blake right there on the table. And within a few moments, he covered Blake's photo up. He's just alone in that interrogation room with the photo of Blake. And I can't remember if he covered it with something or if he just turned it. He may have just turned it over, but regardless.
Wow. And were they, it wasn't like a death photo, right? It was just an actual photo of...
Oh, yeah, no, it was like I don't know if it was their school photos, but something along those lines.
The jury was shown more than 8 hours of interrogation video. At one point, the investigator tells Christopher to say the names of Kimberly, Abigail, Cassandra, and Blake, but he refuses. Near the end, the detectives ask him to guess at what happened. He said, "I've gone over and over it, and the only thing I can think of is that Kimberly somehow got a hold of the gun." He then said that maybe she shot him and then shot the children. Asked how Kimberly had gotten his gun in the first place, Christopher told him that he must have forgotten to lock it back up in his closet after he had gone shooting the night before. That final interview, by the way, had taken place on Father's Day. A police ballistics expert testified that Christopher had been wearing a fleece jacket on the day of the killings. She said that the jacket had bullet holes that matched the caliber of the weapon that had been used. The holes were above the front left pocket and in the lower back, and appeared to have been made by a single gunshot. She said the jacket had likely been wrapped around the handgun when it was fired. And just to put that testimony into perspective, prosecutors were arguing that Christopher had used that jacket to cushion the blow when he shot himself. And in addition to that, the ballistics expert also testified that the bullet hole in the leg of Christopher's jeans showed that he was shot from closer than 6 inches. FBI examiner Scott Hall showed the jury messages from a journal that Christopher kept while in jail. In the journal, Christopher wrote, "This journal will serve as a written daily meditation. the ups and downs, feelings and thoughts and lessons of each day. The journal never made any mention of Kimberly or his children. It was almost as if they didn't exist to him. Graphic autopsy photos were displayed on a flat-screen TV in front of the jury. Larry Bloom, a pathologist, testified that Kimberly and the kids were all shot from no more than 2 feet away. He said he was unable to determine if Kimberly had shot herself under the chin or if she had been shot by somebody else. Bloom's testimony was based on autopsy photos, a review of the autopsy report, and police reports, along with photos from the crime scene. The original pathologist who had performed the actual autopsies had passed away in 2010. Bloom said Kimberly had been shot once, and that Blake, Abigail, and Cassandra had been shot once in the torso and once in the head. John said that testimony was heartbreaking.
The gunshots, they were all at close range. And I believe he shot him each one of them in the torso first and then the head. And he had already shot their mother. They thought they were going to a water park, and he pulls over, and he walks around the side of the car, and all of a sudden, out of the blue, Dad shoots Mom. And then Dad reaches around and shoots his 2 daughters, torso, head, and he gets to Blake. And there's evidence about where Blake was shot. It's just so heartbreaking because he was shot under, in his armpit, meaning he had his arms up in a defensive manner because he saw what his father had just done to his sisters. And he was trying to survive. And I remember, too, there was evidence about the bullet, about how it went through his body but didn't finally pierce his shirt. And they said it was because of how hard he must have been pushing his body back against the back seat.
I asked John what the most damning testimony from the trial was, what that figurative smoking gun was, and he told me that it was the blood evidence. He said that Christopher's story of having pulled over, Kimberly shooting him getting out of the car and limping away, and then returning to find his entire family dead, was pretty much debunked by the blood evidence presented by the prosecution.
When it got to the blood evidence, it just didn't make sense. His story, nothing about the blood evidence fit with what he claimed, mostly because so his blood was found on the floor of the car on the passenger side between Kimberly's feet, where they say he dropped the gun. So if Vaughn is sitting in the driver's seat, as he said he was, and Kimberly shoots in the passenger seat toward the driver's seat, shoots him, and then he immediately gets out of the car and never gets back in. How does his blood end up between her feet on the passenger side? And they never had an answer for that.
And that wasn't all. The state's police forensic expert, Kelly Krujnik, told jurors that Kimberly's blood was also found splattered on the front of Christopher's fleece jacket, in addition to his own. And Christopher's blood was found splattered on her khaki shorts, as well as on her plaid shirt that she had been wearing. A blood spatter expert named Paul Kish also said that the blood spatter evidence does not fit with Christopher's story. Christopher's blood was found on the center console, the side of Kimberly's shorts, on the carpet between her feet, and on both sides of her seatbelt, including on the buckle. Kish also pointed out that Kimberly's blood on the center console had been disturbed in the minute or so after it fell, with some of it being wiped in the direction from the driver's seat towards the passenger seat, and that the person who came into contact with that blood was not Kimberly. He testified that there was a pattern of disturbance on that center console where an object interrupted the normal pattern of dripping blood, and that it happened after Kimberly had been shot. I asked John about what Christopher's demeanor was like as he was hearing all of this testimony.
Really, there was only one time where I thought I saw some emotion from him. And that was when they showed the jury Kimberly's shirt. They still had the red and white checked shirt that Kimberly had been wearing the day he killed her. And they held it up. And I was watching him, and he seemed to choke up maybe a little. And now maybe I imagined it. But I had another reporter that I was with, and she insisted she saw it too, that he kind of got choked up a little. And you know, I don't know what that is or what that was. You know, there's his wife's shirt. It was nearly 7 years after her death, after he murdered her. But you know, at some point, presumably he cared about her. Who knows? You know, I try not to try and figure out what's going on in the minds of a killer like that, because I just don't know that that's something you can do. But regardless, that was the one time that I thought I saw him get slightly emotional in the courtroom. Otherwise, it was just straight and narrow level, you know, just riding this out.
More damning evidence came from Christopher's computer. A forensic investigator testified that she found photos from a scouting trip Christopher had made to the Yukon, lists of things that he would need to survive long term, and manuals on how to hunt. He had also posted messages on a social networking site using the screen name D. Woodsman. In one passage, he quoted a poem by Henry David Thoreau that in hindsight is pretty eerie.
It says, "If you are ready to leave father and mother and brother and sister and wife and child and friends and never see them again, if you have paid your debts and made your will and settled all your affairs and are a free man, then you are ready for a walk."
Kimberly's computer, however, showed that she had visited marriage counseling sites, and she was defending her marriage in emails to friends and classmates. She said that she could trust Christopher while he was out of town because he doesn't put himself in the position to cheat. He's not out cruising the bars. He has never really been that type. The last witness that prosecutors called was Illinois State Police investigator Chris Linares. Assistant State's Attorney Christopher Regis handed him Kimberly's purse and asked him to look inside. Linares took out a stack of about 15 family photos that he had found inside of the purse after Kimberly's death. The photos weren't shown to the jurors, but Linares described them. This is of Kimberly holding her kids. This is Chris, Kimberly, and their children. The prosecutor handed Linares the 9mm handgun, and Linares demonstrated how the weapon went through its rounds. And when he pulled the slide back, there was a loud click in the courtroom. And finally, Linares read a message that Christopher had posted online about seeking contacts in the Yukon. It was from 2 months prior to his family being killed. And it read, "I will be headed up there permanently soon." After calling more than 80 witnesses to the stand and presenting their case for nearly 4 weeks, the prosecution rested. The defense went through their witnesses rather quickly. They brought in an investigator who went over more emails that Kimberly had sent. She talks about the stresses of being a mother, her struggles with her migraine headaches, and struggles with her medications. She said in one email that her doctor may take her off of her migraine meds to help with her anxiety. In another email, she notes that she noticed a big personality change, an anxiety change, and that she was lethargic. Christopher's sister-in-law, Rachel, who is married to his brother, testified about a phone conversation that she had with Kimberly about 2 weeks before the killings. Rachel said that Kimberly had confided in her about having a panic attack during a vacation to Missouri when she couldn't get internet service for a school assignment that she had been working on. Kimberly told her that she had panicked and made a big scene, and that Christopher had to drive her to Springfield to get service. Kimberly told her that she was embarrassed by her outburst and that she was working on it with her doctor. Rachel also said that Kimberly told her that her blood pressure and migraine medications may be causing her anxiety. Then, something quite bizarre happened with one of the defense's witnesses. Christopher's attorneys called their own blood stain expert to the stand, a man named Tom Bevel. Bevel testified that blood stains found on Kimberly's left hand were consistent with something called blowback spatter. Blowback spatter is essentially when a bullet strikes a target and then some high-force impact spatter is directed back towards the gun that fired the shot. Bevel argued that this blowback spatter could mean that Kimberly did shoot herself. Bevel said that although Kimberly was right-handed, he had seen cases where people commit suicide with their weak hand. But on cross-examination is where everything Bevel said sort of fell apart. Assistant State's Attorney Michael Fitzgerald pointed out that Kimberly's blood had also been found on the back of Christopher's jacket. He asked Bevel how that could have happened if she had shot herself last and Christopher was already out of the vehicle. Bevel argued that her blood might have gotten onto it in some earlier incident. Fitzgerald also questioned him about a change that he had made to his report. Bevel said that after speaking with Christopher's defense team, he did change a sentence in the report. He said he took out a sentence that said that Christopher must have unbuckled Kimberly's seatbelt where Christopher's blood was found. He replaced that sentence, saying that instead, Christopher and Kimberly must have come into contact with each other after they were both bleeding. Fitzgerald also pointed out that Christopher's story was that he left the SUV after Kimberly shot him and before she killed herself. But the blood evidence suggests that he was still in the SUV after she was shot. And shockingly, Bevel agreed that it didn't make sense, and he said, "It does not jive. No, sir."
Even Vaughn's own blood expert said, yeah, this doesn't make sense. And so when you get to that point, that's why I think the blood was the most damning part of this. They just couldn't get around it.
Christopher Vaughn told the judge that he was not going to testify. Prosecutors called one rebuttal witness, Dr. Michael Schrift, who is the director of neuropsychiatry at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Dr. Schrift testified that the medications that Kimberly had been taking, Topamax and nortriptyline, are commonly prescribed together, and that there is no evidence that either drug increases any suicide risks. And just like that, the 5-week murder trial came to a close. In their closing arguments, Prosecutor Fitzgerald reiterated that Christopher wanted to leave his family and go live in the Canadian wilderness. He said, Christopher Vaughn no longer wanted Kimberly, Abigail, Cassandra, and Blake in his life. They were holding him down, and he had to find a way to get out of the life that he was in. And the way he chose to do that was to murder his wife and kids and make it look like Kimberly did it. He said Christopher was callous and that he was more concerned about paramedics ruining his clothes than he was about his wife and children. Fitzgerald said he made complaints about his boots being cut up and his jacket being ruined, but he did not ask about his children. He also said that Kimberly's blood was on Christopher's jacket, something he said could not happen if Christopher was outside of the vehicle when she had shot herself, as Christopher claimed. In the defense's closing arguments, Leonard said that Kimberly was distraught over their troubled marriage and she shot Christopher before killing the children and then herself. Leonard acknowledged that Christopher did want to leave his family, but said that he's not on trial for that. He said the evidence showed that Kimberly was the one who shot her husband and kids, and then herself, and that prosecution witnesses said that the shot that killed Kimberly could have been self-inflicted. That's reasonable doubt, he said. As for Christopher telling police that he couldn't remember the gunshots at first, Leonard said that he did that because he felt guilty about having cheated on his wife, and that he believed that his infidelity is what drove her to kill. The jury, comprised of 4 women and 8 men, got the case at about 3:30 p.m., and by 4:25, they had reached their verdict.
It was so fast, but what the jurors said was that anybody who listened to what they listened to for a month, they listened to a month or more of all of this evidence. And when you're prosecuting, you bring in all the evidence as overwhelming as can be. They said anybody who saw what we saw would have done the same thing.
The jury had taken only 55 minutes to reach their verdict, finding Christopher Vaughn guilty of murdering his wife and 3 children. During Christopher's sentencing, Kimberly's mother and sister gave victim impact statements. Kimberly's mom said that she will no longer be able to exchange jokes with her grandchildren, take them shopping, or teach them to sew. Kimberly's twin sister said that she and Kim would not be able to celebrate their milestone 40th birthday together. She said, "My birthday continues to be very difficult for me because it was Kim's as well, and we always shared it. I silently wonder if my parents and older sister experience pain in my presence because Kim and I not only share our looks, but also many of our personality traits." Judge Rozak asked Christopher if he wanted to say anything, maybe answer the question of why he did it, but Christopher just said, "No, thank you." Christopher's attorney tried to argue that he hadn't received a fair trial due to the news conferences held by Drew Peterson's attorneys, saying that they damaged his own credibility as a defense attorney. Judge Rozak countered that there was no evidence that jurors had even been aware of the other attorneys' news conferences. Because Illinois had abolished the death penalty, and because Christopher was convicted of multiple murders, Judge Rozak had to sentence him to life in prison. And while delivering the sentence, the judge said he found it very frustrating that he could only sentence him to life in prison instead of the death penalty. In addition to being a loving mother and a wife, Kimberly Vaughn was a daughter and a sister. Family and friends described her as a devoted mother. Abigail Vaughn went by Abby. She was 12 years old at the time of her death, and she was a gifted artist and soccer goalie. Cassandra Vaughn went by Sandy, and she was 11 when she was killed. She was reportedly a budding entrepreneur who wanted to start a dog walking business. Blake Vaughn was 8 years old when he died. He was an avid reader and wordsmith, and he had a photographic memory who knew baseball statistics like the back of his hand. This story is one that I don't think I will ever forget, and John tells me that he won't either.
As you can tell, it stuck with me. I mean, this is just some of the most horrible. Still, and I talked to other, I still work with some reporters who were there for bits and pieces of this, at least. I mean, it's still some of the most heartbreaking stuff that they've had to write about.
When these things happen, we always want to know the why, even if we know that it won't make sense to any of us. Because there is, of course, never truly a reason to kill your family, or to kill anybody for that matter. But we still struggle with not knowing why somebody would do this.
The question, I think, for most people looking at this case, certainly it was a question among reporters. It was a question that Kimberly's mother voiced on the stand, I believe, at the sentencing. Why not just divorce her? Why do you have to kill the family to leave? And I don't know that I have an answer to that. But I've always kind of wondered if the answer's in this poem, especially when you're talking about settled all your affairs and are a free man.
And that's all for this episode. I'd like to give a special thank you to John Seidel from the Chicago Sun-Times for agreeing to help me with this case. John now covers federal trials in Chicago. You can find him on Twitter at Seidel Content. I'll put the link for him in the show notes as well. And this was a really heavy episode, so I'm going to leave it there. Thanks to you all for listening. Until next time.